All right, this is the overview for Urban and Community Development, Module 7. This is our last module of the semester. We're going to be focusing on cities and communities and what some of the environmental and social impacts of city and community development are, and how we might develop cities and communities more sustainably. We're going to look at some precedent projects. The one you're looking at here, I think, is that this is an illustration of a planned Houston Energy Corridor District by Sasaki Associates in Houston, Texas. And it is really showing some of the more exemplary aspects of walkable community development. So we'll talk a little bit more about those aspects in a separate lecture and in some readings and videos in this module. So cities can provide ecosystem services if they're designed correctly. And a lot of these ecosystem services, as we've discussed in other modules, are related to trees. So cities can offer carbon storage. If you have lots of trees in the city, they can also, the trees and vegetation can offer habitat. Certainly, they can contribute to human health by through biophilia, biophilic design, as well as actually cleaning the air. Trees have the capability of cleaning polluted air. Food ecosystem services can be provided by cities in urban gardens, in urban agriculture settings. And then, of course, recreation can happen in cities as well. So healthy cities can provide ecosystem services, but most cities currently do not. So let's look at the UN Environmental Programme Sustainable Development Goals report. Most of this data is from 2018. Chapter 11, or Goal 11, asks that we make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Unfortunately, 1 out of 4 urban residents currently lives in slum-like conditions. And not just in other countries, actually in our country, they do. And you'll see that in this lecture. 2 billion people currently don't have access to waste collection services. And so this does result in a lot of pollution and lack of sanitation in cities. 9 out of 10 urban residents breathe polluted air in our country. And it's actually quite bad. We'll talk about that also a little bit later. Only half of urban residents have convenient access to public transportation, which means that our cities are full of cars. And some people just can't get to work very easily. They may not be able to afford to have a car in a city, but they also don't have access to public transportation. Access by this definition means that they live within 500 meters of a bus stop and 1,000 meters of a rail system or a ferry terminal. Because a huge percentage of the population, 60%, will live in cities within the next 10 years, countries all over the world are taking cities very seriously, and they are coming up with national urban plans. 150 countries have come up with national urban plans, with almost half of them already in the implementation phase, which means that they're already implementing the plan. So before we start talking about what makes good cities and things that we can do in cities to improve them, I just want to remind you of some environmental impacts of cities and communities. We talked in module 3, in the water module, about how stormwater in cities is a huge issue because of the extreme impervious surfaces of the rooftops and the streams the streets and the parking lots. We get concentrated stormwater that degrades our waterways. We also get pollutants running off of the rooftops and the streets into our waterways. So this is a huge environmental impact in cities. There is a distinct lack of habitat in cities. And cities also have a problem with the urban heat island effect, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and air pollution. So the urban heat island effect is something that happens with all of the impervious and dark colored surfaces in urban areas. Late in the day, the sun has been absorbed by all of these surfaces, streets, parking lots, building rooftops, many of which are dark colored, and the heat starts to radiate out of these surfaces that have absorbed the heat. So in a typical weather condition on an 85-degree day, say in suburban residential areas or in rural areas, the same weather condition might be 7 or 8 degrees hotter in an urban condition. And this is huge in terms of air conditioning loads, health of the urban residents, et cetera. The image that you see on the left is an infrared photo of Louisville, which is a city, but it's not a huge city. Still, you can see how much hotter it is in urban Louisville than it is even just across the river in areas with more vegetation. So obviously the blue areas are the cooler areas, and these are not, it's not a coincidence that these are all the vegetated areas. And then of course, the very urban environment of downtown Louisville is much hotter. So why do we care? Aside from air conditioning loads, we care because this has a tremendous impact on human health. Ground level ozone forms when heat and sunlight allow the reaction of two very common pollutants, nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. These are VOCs. And what happens is the ground level ozone gets trapped at the level of the buildings and the streets, and has a tremendous human health impact in that people breathe this polluted air, and the most vulnerable people, the elderly and children, really suffer from it. Incidences of asthma are multiple times greater in cities, in children who live in cities, than in children who live in suburbs. This is a huge problem. Same thing for elderly people. But really, it's not good for anyone to breathe air pollution. And it's very surprising how many days of the year it is unsafe to breathe air outside in some of our major cities. Los Angeles is one of the worst. Cities in the Southeast and the Southwest suffer most from urban heat island impacts. So, looking at this diagram carefully, what happens in cities is that poor air quality gets trapped between the buildings, and it just continues to recirculate. Poor air quality results from trucks or buses or cars stopping and starting, and it gets trapped in the canyons. Air pollution is much greater where traffic idles, so where you have a traffic jam. Braking and accelerating increases vehicle emissions as well. And unfortunately, children are closer to the vehicle exhaust and to higher pollutant concentrations, and of course they suffer more. So inserting vegetation into cities can go a long way toward improving these problems. Vegetation, of course, breaks up the airflow. It cleans the air. It actually removes nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides from the air. And then varying the height of buildings also helps. Putting green walls on buildings, putting hedges next to streets, all of these things will help, in addition to orienting streets with prevailing winds. That will carry the pollution away from cities. In addition to the urban heat island impacts and the air quality impacts of cities and communities, there is a distinct lack of affordable housing in cities. The image on the top is actually in Los Angeles. One of the wealthiest cities in our country, also has the most homeless population of any city in the US. And this is a huge deal. This is directly related to a lack of affordable housing. Also, what results from cities, this is the Bronx in the just outside New York, another very wealthy city. The Bronx is very poor, it's very urbanized, not much green space, and lack of access to green space can have health impacts on the population, as well as study after study has shown that kids who have access to green space actually learn better, have higher test scores than kids who do not have access to green space. Additionally, cities oftentimes have unsafe streets. And, you know, more than anywhere else, there are equity issues in cities. Poor people who live in cities have unequal access to transit, have less access to transit, green space, and healthy food. Wealthier people who live in cities have more access to transit, green space, and healthy food. So cities really tend to highlight equity issues. So the last issue, major issue with cities is unsafe streets. Our streets in cities and suburbs are auto-dominated. Traffic planners for years have tried to move traffic through urban areas and suburban areas as quickly as possible to get as many cars moving quickly and out of the way and to their destinations. A lot of streets don't have sidewalks, so consequently they're fairly unfriendly to pedestrians. And when you have buildings set back from the street so much, you don't have people's eyes on the street, and so you have a lot more crime happening along the streets, especially where pedestrians are trying to walk along the streets. So safe streets are a really key aspect of sustainable communities. So the Project for Public Spaces, it has a great website if you're interested in this issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in the other lecture in this module, but they have identified the benefits of great places and the qualities of great places. So a great place has good accessibility. It's more walkable, it's safe for pedestrians, it has public transit that's accessible, it has good connections between different uses in the place. A great place builds and supports the local economy. So there's entrepreneurship, economic development, higher real estate values, local ownership, local value, etc. A great place has good sociability, offers opportunities for social interaction, has a diverse population, encourages creativity in the community and sociability. A great place promotes health, increased physical activity, access to fresh food, greater social inclusion and security. A great place nurtures and defines a sense of community. So there's a sense of pride and volunteerism, perpetuation of integrity and values, less need for municipal control, including policing. And it's more self-managing. The citizens of the community are more engaged in the health and well-being of the community. And lastly, a great place promotes a sense of comfort. It's visually pleasing. There's a sense of belonging of the people who either live there, work there, or recreate there. There's a feeling of freedom, but greater security, etc. So I challenge you to think about the places that are important to you and see if they adhere to some of these, or if they offer some of these benefits. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of the strategies that make great places, and we'll have a lecture devoted to that in this module. Walkable streets are so important. Sidewalks, crosswalks, slower traffic, protection from traffic, trees, ground floor retail to create activity on the street, and retail that's relatively close to the street instead of set back, like so much of our suburban fabric is connected street networks. Instead of everybody living on a cul-de-sac and only knowing a few of their neighbors, having street networks where you can easily walk from one place to another without having to take the long way around and walk on a street where nobody lives and no commercial uses are located, but it's just a collector street for fast traffic. This is a much more walkable and safe neighborhood, but it's also pretty efficient for driving, but at slow speeds. Urban habitat is critical. In this diagram, this is a master plan for a community in the Philippines, but in this diagram, these circles that are kind of yellowish orange are showing a radius of a 5-minute walk, so that every house in this community has a 5-minute walk or less to green space. Now that is access to green space. Additionally, this community grows food, and we'll hear more about that in the other lecture. Urban and suburban infill is another good strategy to make good places. The upper example, of course, is our own Hillsborough Street, but even just filling in new housing where there are vacant lots can do so much for enlivening the street and making streets comfortable, safe, and walkable. And then the last strategy that we'll look at is the idea of a closed loop community. We'll look at a community in Stockholm that uses waste from one part of the community as food for another. So for instance, in the housing, the wastewater from the housing goes to the wastewater treatment plant. The biogas from the wastewater treatment plant is captured and used to fuel buses and vans in the community. The biosolids from the wastewater treatment plant are used as fertilizer for the farm fields. The purified wastewater is sent back to a water treatment plant and released to the sea. That's not necessarily closed loop, but this is a really interesting community that is very similar to the idea of industrial ecology and closed loop resources that we talked about in module 5, but it's happening on the community scale. And there are other communities that you'll study in this module that are doing similar things. We will talk about greenery and cities, and you probably think she keeps coming back to trees, but you know, the reality is trees are the answer for a lot of our urban problems. This image on the left is not a real city. It's just a depiction of what could be in our cities, and it would really solve a lot of the health and environmental issues that our cities face. And we'll also talk about biophilia and biophilic design as it relates to cities. We'll watch a documentary about the work of Timothy Beatley, who is a professor at the University of Virginia, pushing the idea of biophilic cities. We will look at the Living Community Challenge. Now, we've talked about the Living Building Challenge. We've talked about the Living Material Challenge. There is also a Living Community Challenge, and some of these credits will look very similar to the Living Building Challenge and to the Living Material Challenge, the Living Product Challenge. But some of these ideas, net positive waste, net positive energy, net positive water, all translate to cities, as well as buildings and products. So we'll compare the Living Community Challenge with another rating system, LEED for Neighborhood Development. LEED for Neighborhood Development is far more commonly used because the standards maybe aren't quite as high, but certainly it does encourage great neighborhoods and great communities. So we'll look closely at that, and you'll do some comparison between LEED ND and the Living Community Challenge. So in conclusion, these are the Module 7 objectives. We'll relate community development practices to climate change, habitat destruction, stormwater impacts, and we'll look at equity issues of these impacts. We'll discuss the standards for sustainable urbanism. We'll compare exemplary sustainable urbanism case studies I will ask you to document a local complete street case study, and then we'll talk about roles of urban planners, landscape architects, developers, and city officials as they relate to the planning and design of sustainable communities. Thank you.